In this video lesson, we'll discuss Reconstruction under Republican rule, and we'll discuss the terms carpetbaggers, scalawags, graft, and the KKK. The South was in disarray following the Civil War. Physically, it was devastated because the majority of the war had been fought in the South. Economically, the economy had been destroyed because of the Confederate money and the lack of value that it had held. The battlefields needed to be cleaned up, and they needed to stop the spread of disease. Public works programs needed to be implemented to be able to help the newly freed men as well as the poor whites in the South. And two groups of people are going to begin to form in the South. They're going to be represented as carpetbaggers, which is what's represented in this political cartoon, and scalawags. Carpetbaggers were people who actually came down from the north to be able to try to take advantage of the rebuilding in the South. And they actually carried bags made out of carpet that look very similar to what this man is carrying here and here. And that's what they carried their belongings in. Scalawags were people who were originally from the South who just tried to take advantage of the economic issues that were happening during that time period and tried to cash in or make money on other people's difficulties. By 1870, all former Confederate states had rejoined the Union. Carpetbaggers, again, were Northerners that moved to the South. This was viewed by the South as an intrusion and people who wanted to profit from the South's post-war troubles. Scalawags were white Southerners who supported Reconstruction, but the Southerners mostly disliked them as well. They felt, again, that they were trying to cash in on the South's post-war troubles. Thousands of formerly enslaved people took part in governing the South and were elected to local, state, and federal legislatures. You had a man named Joseph Rainey, who was the first African-American elected to the House of Representatives, and a man named Hiram Revels, who was the first African-American to become a senator in the United States Senate. Again, this is the map, just to review, military reconstruction, which had been begun in an effort to implement the plan for Reconstruction and to make sure that the southern states were abiding by the laws and that the freedmen were not being unfairly punished. And this plan was actually run by the North and the generals that split up the different military districts. And again, we talked about this in the earlier video, so I won't go into detail about it again. The Republican Party became very powerful in the South as a result of Republican Reconstruction. And they started many major reforms. They began to repeal the black codes that the South had tried to put into place to limit the newly freed men. They established public school systems, which had never been established in the South at all, to be able to educate the children of poor whites as well as the newly freed men. Some Republicans in the South were very corrupt, though, and graft, which means getting money illegally through politics, was very common during this time period in both the South and in the North. There were lots of problems faced by the government for the newly freed slaves. They were very unsure of what to do with their new freedoms. They were not allowed to travel without a pass. They had no tools to be able to work, no land of their own to actually farm, and no money to buy any of these things. And so it's going to be a struggle for the newly freed men after the Civil War to be able to establish themselves. So basically, during slavery, they did not have any rights. They were a forced labor system. They had no freedom of movement without permission. Family members were sold away from one another, and no representation in government. Now, then when they were given their freedom, slavery was banned. They were free to work for wages. They could move and live anywhere. Many families were reunited, and they could serve in political office. But they also were denied rights at the same time. And the system of sharecropping is going to create a cycle of poverty, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. The ability to vote and hold office were restricted in the South, and white leadership is going to regain control of the southern state governments eventually and make it very difficult for them to be able to gain political office. There was a reunification after the Civil War of many slave families that had been sold apart. Finding family members was a very difficult task. For example, one man walked 600 miles from Georgia to North Carolina to find his wife and his children. The Freedmen's Bureau helped these families reunify, and ex-slaves were now allowed to marry. African American communities become very involved in the education of the newly freed men. After the Civil War, the slaves that were the former slaves that were newly freedmen must be taught to read and write. So 80% of the freed slaves during this time period and over the age of 20 were actually illiterate and could not read or write. By 1877, there were 600,000 African Americans enrolled in elementary schools, and African American colleges began to appear in the South as well. African American communities also became very involved in religion, in the religious life of the newly freed men. The slaves, former slaves, the newly freed men, were very spiritual. So African American churches become very important as community centers. The churches had to be established for religious services and to be able to support the lives of the newly freed men. Many Baptist and Methodist churches are going to appear in the South during this time period. African American communities also supported African Americans and newly freed men entering politics. And they're going to enter politics in government and in different areas of society. As we mentioned before, Hiram Revels will become the first African American senator, and local and state governments will begin to see a lot of African American involvement. Some Southerners actually organized to resist the newly freed men from being able to hold position in society or in political office. Some Southerners created secret societies. One of them specifically is called the Ku Klux Klan, which terrorized the newly freed men and African Americans and their Republican supporters. The Klan had two goals. The first goal was to drive out the Union troops and the carpetbaggers that had come from the North. The second goal was to regain political control of the South. Early in the 1870s, Congress passed laws to end violence in the South, and especially they made activities of the Ku Klux Klan illegal. Many Klansmen were arrested, but most Southern juries let them go. Very few spent any time in jail. So the discussion question that I just want to review with you is, what was the purpose, or what were the purposes of the original Ku Klux Klan? And so the two original goals of the Ku Klux Klan were to, number one, drive white Northerners, which were Republicans and carpetbaggers, out of the South, and to reinstitute white control of the South. A secondary goal will be to intimidate African Americans with violence. And we'll discuss more about the Ku Klux Klan and this period during Reconstruction in our lesson in class.